Hi, good afternoon to everyone. Good morning to our speaker. Thank you very much for being with us today. Also, thanks to everyone who's watching the video afterwards, the recording of the conference. Thank you very much. Before introducing the speaker, I'd like to do a first small introduction about the topic he's going to develop today. First of all, our speaker will present us the concept of sustainable development and how can we sustainably develop natural resources. In addition, he will introduce the potential for sustainable development of water supply, focused on dam and water reservoirs. In addition, he will also explain us if dams and water reservoirs can be developed in a sustainable manner, and if so, how can be developed in a sustainable manner. Furthermore, our speaker will explain us the role of the engineering design practice and the role of the economic evaluation of projects related to the sustainable development. And to conclude, our speaker will also highlight the effects of climate change towards the sustainable development of dams and water reservoirs and the path that we should follow in order to ensure, again, the sustainable development of dams and water reservoirs. Our speaker today is Dr. George Annandale, who is a consultant engineer providing services in sustainable development of dam and reservoir projects, the impacts of climate change on water resource infrastructure, dam safety, reservoir sedimentation management, hydraulic structures design, and the general field of hydrology and hydraulics. Dr. Annandale has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Pretoria, a master's in geotechnical engineering from the University of Witwatersrand, and a doctoral engineering degree from the University of Pretoria as well. He has more than 42 years of experience as a consultant in civil engineering, principally focusing on dams. He also has made important contributions to the profession, and he is internationally recognized for his work in reservoir sedimentation management and score technology. Furthermore, he has participated as a speaker and keynote speaker at numerous international conferences, and he has authored or co-authored 4 books on reservoir sedimentation management, sustainable development, and score. Acknowledging all his achievements, the International Water Power and Dam Construction named him in 2020 as among the 20 engineers that made a significant international contribution to dam engineering. Without further introduction, Dr. George Annandale, I give you the floor. Thank you.
What I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about sustainable development of multipurpose hydropower. And I think that what you'll find is most probably that what I tell you is different to what you normally may learn in the concept of sustainability. Okay, so let's go on. So firstly, sustainable development is really a complex issue. And I think firstly, I just want to, I believe that this is a multidisciplinary audience. So what is multipurpose hydropower? It's essentially dams that can provide energy, a water supply, and also can control floods. And so that is just as a general introduction for those of you who are not civil engineers. Then the next question is, how do we define sustainable development? And I'll give a definition how I see it, so that you at least understand where I'm coming from. And then I'll go into identifying the dominant factors that prevents sustainable development of dams and reservoirs. So we'll be looking at climate change, reservoir sedimentation, and then how engineers and economists and policymakers make decisions, which essentially, as you'll see, is lead to non-sustainable development of dams and reservoirs. And then what we'll do is to to look at, well, what can we do to ensure sustainable development? And as you'll notice as we go on, is that I will essentially talk about the role of cognitive psychology in decision making. We look at ethics and developing sustainable development policy. So let's start with what is sustainable development. And the most succinct definition, in my view, was developed by the Brundtland Commission of the United Nations when they developed our Common Future Report in 1987. And it says that sustainable development seeks to meet the needs and aspirations of the present without compromising the ability to meet those in the future. So what it really comes down to, it focuses on what one can call intergenerational equity. What that means is it's fairness between generations. And then environmental preservation, from this point of view, is a desirable consequence of sustainable development. It's not the objective. Okay? So if we must summarize it, we can say that sustainable development is the harmonizing of engineering, environmental, and economic aspects of projects with the main focus of creating intergenerational equity, that is fairness between generations. So now that we know that, the next issue that we need to discuss is how do we sustainably develop a resource. And as you may know, there are renewable resources and exhaustible resources, and the only resources we can really sustainably develop are renewable resources. And we can only do that if we use them at a rate that is smaller than the rate at which they are regenerated. So for example, here, mining can never be sustainably developed because that's an exhaustible resource. Whereas if we plant wheat, we can sustainably develop that because it's a renewable resource. So then if we look at water, fresh water, if we look at the fresh water supply and also the issue of generating power with water, we want to ask, well, is this a renewable or an exhaustible resource? And to get some idea of how much water we have on Earth, we can compare the amount of water to the diameter of the Earth, which is 12,756 kilometers. And if we take all water on Earth, on the oceans and the ice caps, everything in groundwater, and we put that in a sphere, it will have a diameter of 1,383 kilometers. So that's a small amount. And there's only so much water on Earth, so that really can be viewed as an exhaustible resource. But what we are generally interested in is fresh water. So if we take all the fresh, accessible groundwater on Earth, and we place that in a sphere, it will fill a sphere with a diameter of 69 kilometers. And if we take all the river water on Earth, and we place that in a sphere, it will be a sphere with a diameter of only 16 kilometers. So that's not a lot of water. But the good news is that we can view it as a renewable resource because of the hydrological cycle. So then the question is, if we want to sustainably develop the water resources, the freshwater resources, which one of these two has the greatest potential for sustainable development? So to answer that question, we now come back to that whole question of what is the rate of replenishment of these two resources, and how does that compare to the rate of usage? So if we look at the two resources, we can use the residence time of water in those resources as a proxy for their replenishment time. So residence time is the time it will take a drop of water to move through the entire resource from its origin to its final end. And if we take all the fresh groundwater on Earth and replenish, the residence time for that is 1,400 years. What that means is if we were able to magically remove all fresh groundwater on Earth in an instant, it will take 1,400 years for it to replenish. On the other hand, if we look at river water, the residence time of river water is 16 to 18 days. So what that means then, if we were magically able to remove all the river water on Earth in an instant, it'll be back in about 2 weeks. Okay, so that's the residence times. And then if we now compare it to our usage of water, which is daily, we just from a visceral point of view, we can see that because the replenishment time of groundwater is so much longer than the daily usage time of fresh water, that this must probably more feasible to develop river water. The replenishment time and the daily usage time are roughly on the same scale. So if we then look at groundwater on Earth, we see that this sort of guttural feel of ours that it's better to develop river water is true. This map here shows all the large aquifers on Earth, and the ones in black here are the ones that are not overutilized, and the gold ones here are the ones that are overutilized. And research by the University of Utrecht and the McGill University in Canada developed this thing I call the groundwater footprint. And what that means is that if you take the area of a aquifer, like the North Arabian aquifer here, and you say, if I want to sustainably use that, how big must this area be where the rain would fall onto it to replenish it on an annual basis so that I do not overutilize it? So seen differently, for example, the North Arabian aquifer is 48 times overutilized on an annual basis. And although if one just look at this map, it looks like the non-overutilized groundwater resources is much larger than the overutilized ones, we can then look globally, and the global footprint is 3.5. So what this means is that globally we use 3.5 times more groundwater than what is replenished on an annual basis. So from that we can, I think, conclusively say that river water has a greater potential for sustainable development because groundwater is already overutilized. Now, a problem with river water is that it doesn't flow constantly. Okay, so this is a hydrograph, and it shows annual flows in this river over time. So this is time here, and this here is the amount of water, the volume of water on an annual basis. The red line here gives you the long-term average annual flow. So if we were to supply water from this river, you see, for example, here is a period of 11 years where the annual flows are lower than the long-term average. So we'll have to have a very large reservoir to sustainably supply water from this river over this long multiple-year drought. Okay. And this, as I'll demonstrate to you, will become more important when we look at climate change, the effects of climate change. Now, what do we do to address this issue? In rivers, we build dams, and the whole intent of a dam is to create a reservoir behind it so that this variable inflow into the reservoir can be controlled or regulated so that we can supply power and water reliably downstream. And this system, if we look at the system as a whole, we have a dam and a reservoir. That is the system we are looking at. There are two failure modes, okay? And if this system fails, we cannot provide its service. So the first mode is the dam fails. So if the dam fails, it's no more here. We cannot store the water anymore, and we cannot provide the services that this facility was built for. The second mode is that the dam may stay in place for many, many years, but we fill the reservoir with sediment, and we don't have any more storage space for the water, and again, we fail to provide the services that this facility was built for. So those are the two main failure modes. So what is our goal? Our goal is to develop sustainable infrastructure. And as indicated previously, how do we accomplish it? We focus on creating intergenerational equity. And this is done by maintaining the reliability of the services provided by the infrastructure, both now and in the future. And we manage the deterioration of the infrastructure. We make sure the dam stays in place, and we prevent storage loss. And then obviously climate change comes in that we have to take account of. And there are many uncertainties associated with that. And to deal with these uncertainties, we have to develop resilient infrastructure. So let's first look at climate change. The two principal variables that we are interested in when we want to reliably supply water and power are changes in the mean annual river flow caused by climate change. And the second very important one is the change in hydrologic variability. So if we look at predictions into the future, there's many studies that have been done. This shows an indication of how mean annual flow will increase or decrease throughout the world. So these blue ones here is in the places where it will increase. And then the red and brown ones are places where it will decrease. So with you being in Europe, that is the prediction for Europe, that it will most probably decrease. That's just the mean annual flows. If we look at hydrologic variability, the general agreement between all scientists is that hydrologic variability will increase globally. It's not an increase or decrease, it's just going to increase. So let's look at what the impact of such an increase might be. This here is a map of the world, and all these areas in gold here are places in the world where multiple year droughts occur. That is, droughts of 2 years or longer. For example, I'm originally from South Africa, and when I grew up in South Africa, my memory of water supply is we were always under restrictions, and we generally would have their droughts lasting 5 to 7 years on a regular basis. If you look at Europe, at the moment, it's only Portugal and Spain that really have this problem. But if we now make an assumption, I just made an assumption, just say generally that hydrologic variability will increase by 25% over the entire world. What will happen to these areas? And if we do that, we notice that there's a significant increase in the size of these areas in the world where droughts over many years will occur, multiple year droughts. And if you look at Europe, you can see there is there's probably something that you'll have to take account of in your future. Okay. So what does it mean? How do we prepare for this issue if we look at climate change? Now we can prepare a graph. On this graph, on the ordinate, we have the yield from a river or a dam and reservoir that we have in the river. And it's expressed as a percentage of the mean annual flow in the river, 0 to 100%. And on the abscissa, we plot hydrologic variability. That is the annual coefficient of variation of flows in a river. And this is the proxy that we use for the effect of climate change. So if we would build a dam in a river with a reservoir that has a volume of about 60% of the mean annual flow in that river, the relationship between hydrologic variability and yield will look like this. Okay. So if we start off with, the average hydrologic variability in the world, it's about 0.3. So we start at a hydrologic variability of 0.3, and due to climate change, it increases to 0.6. You can see that the amount of water that we can reliably get from this dam and reservoir drops significantly. So if we now build a reservoir that's got a larger volume of 1 times the mean annual flow, you can see that the reduction is less. And if we build it even larger, say 2 times the mean annual flow, it's much less sensitive to the effects of climate change. So just as a general rule, what I'm going to try and do is create as large as possible storage in rivers so that we can reliably supply water, and that provides resilience against climate change. Okay? So large reservoir storage provides resilience. So now what happens globally? If we look at the construction of large dams throughout the world from about 1900 to 2020, what you'll notice is that we continuously build reservoirs and the global volume increases. So that sounds like a good idea. Okay, we said with climate change, we need more storage. But the thing is that there's something called reservoir sedimentation. So as rivers flow into reservoirs, they carry sediment, salt and clay and sand and cobbles. And as they flow into the reservoir, the water velocity slows down and all this sediment deposits in the reservoir. And it causes lots of problems. It reduces storage. And like in this case here, you can see that the inlet to this reservoir has been severely compromised. This is a Peonia Reservoir in Colorado in the United States. So the question that we need to ask then is, we have climate change that's giving us a reduced reliability of water supply. And if we now also look at reservoir sedimentation, what is the combined effect? So if we only have climate change and a reservoir, say that we've built that has a volume of 2 times the mean annual flow, there is a small reduction in yield that will occur because of that. But if this reservoir volume decreases significantly due to sedimentation, and say goes down to 60% of the mean annual flow, then our yield reduces to about 60% of the mean annual flow. So you see that's a significant reduction. So the combined effect of climate change and reservoir sedimentation provides us with significant problems. So if we now look globally, what happens if you take account of reservoir sedimentation? You see this is the constructed volumes that has been developed over the years. And generally, estimates are that we're losing about 1% of storage per year of all the reservoirs on Earth. And if we account for that, you can now see that the net storage that's available for us to use is actually decreasing over time. And that we are losing more storage to reservoir sedimentation than what we're adding by building new dams. So this is a problem that we need to deal with. If we look on a per capita basis, because the world population is growing, and say how much storage is available per person, what we see is that currently the net capita storage per person is currently where we last in 1960. So we are really moving backwards as a global society. Now, this storage loss is really unnecessary because we have various technologies to manage sediment, and they have been implemented. And I'm not going to deal with that in any detail. That is a lecture in itself. But they can be classified as catchment management. In other words, we reduce the amount of sediment that will flow into a reservoir by preventing erosion in the upstream catchment. We can route sediment through reservoirs. In other words, if we have a river flowing into a reservoir with a large amount of sediment, we create flow conditions within the reservoir so that you can pass that sediment through the reservoir. And this here is an example of it. This is Xiaolongdi Dam and Reservoir in China. And they are passing here sediment through the reservoir and preventing it from settling in the reservoir. And then there's a third group of techniques, which is sediment removal. So if we already deposited sediment in reservoirs, there are techniques that we can use to remove it. But the sad thing is that this is generally not implemented in engineering design. And what happens is that that if we would implement it, okay, this is a condition if we don't implement it, which is currently the case. But if we would implement reservoir sedimentation management, we may not be able to preserve all the storage, but we can at least preserve a significant amount of storage and ensure benefits for future generations. Now, the question is, why are we not doing this? And the real reason is irrational decision making. And this irrational decision making leads to non-sustainable development. So let's look at this. Generally, assumptions in economic analysis is that we as humans are rational beings. That's the assumption. And we make decisions based on rational thought. Okay. Now, a lot of research has been done by Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years ago. And what he and his colleagues researched found that we are, as humans, not rational. We base our general decisions on irrational thought. And then he also said, well, this can be changed. They made this a very extensive research and said there are really two systems of thinking in human beings. One is subjective thinking, which is normally used, and the other is rational thinking, which is seldom used. And the reason why we seldom use this is because it requires additional effort. So we have these two systems. System one operates automatically and quickly. It's based on subjective judgment, and we develop intuitive estimates of probability. Okay? And why do we do that? Because it requires very little effort. System two requires significant effort of mental activities, thought and analysis, complex computations, and that requires significant energy and effort, and that's seldom used. Okay. And that is really the big problem why we are not sustainably developing dams and reservoirs and many other things on Earth. Okay, you can also just think on the whole concept of climate change in general. Well, why are we struggling so much? So let's just look at the characteristics of thinking. There's a theory by Kahneman called prospect theory. And what it essentially comes down to is he compares actual gains and losses. So these are actual gains and actual losses to how we psychologically interpret the utility of those gains or losses. And what he found is that the relationship has an S-curve like this. So the first thing is that the way that we psychologically interpret actual gains and losses differ. So for example, here we have 4 units, say $4 million of gains, and psychologically we only give it the desirability about 3 units. Whereas if we would then say, how do we experience 4 units, $4 million in losses, that is significant. Okay, so there's this whole issue of loss aversion. That's the first thing. The second thing is that as our gains increases, the way that we experience the desirability of those gains decreases. It's called diminishing sensitivity. Now, on average, there are 2 things we need to do. Firstly, we often have to decide between a loss and a gain. Okay? And because of the way that we psychologically experience, say, a $4 million gain versus a $4 million loss, we have what is called risk aversion behavior. So we select to rather go with the gain, okay, because we experience it different. For example, say we have a dam in place that would cause a gain, that we don't have damages to property to the value of $4 million. The way we experience it is that we experience it as say 3 units here. But if we didn't have the dam and we lost 4 million, it will be tremendous losses. So what we do go for is we go for designing this dam and protecting us against floods. But in the case that we are looking at here, reservoir, whether we should implement reservoir sedimentation management, we have to decide between 2 losses. Okay. So we are operating in this area here. We're not looking at gains at the moment. So what he found is that if we have a small but sure loss over here somewhere, and we have to decide between getting that or a large probable loss in the future, something that may or may not happen, generally we have what's called risk-seeking behavior, and we generally select this large probable loss. Okay, so now let's look at this in the problem that we are looking at. So we are looking whether we should implement reservoir sedimentation or not. We must decide between 2 losses. The one is that we're going to have, if we implement it, we're going to have additional cost, and our water supply may be slightly less because we have to do things to the reservoir. It's going to provide less water on an annual basis. But if we implement this reservoir sedimentation management approach, we can preserve reservoir storage over the long term, and we can ensure that future generations can get water. So we're creating intergenerational equity. The second alternative that you can look at is not implementing reservoir sedimentation management, so there's no additional cost. And we can perceive in the short term, well, we're going to have more water. And from a short-term point of view, we say, oh, that's certain. And the fact that we will only have a probable loss in the future, that's how these people reason, is not really of a concern to us. And it doesn't create intergenerational equity. So how do we look at these 2 things? If we implement system 1 thinking, which we normally do, okay, we use this concept of time preference, which you have studied, I'm sure, in your economic analysis classes. And what we say is, well, right now, I'm certain I'm going to have a lot of water available, and it's valuable to me. And future generations, they may have or may not have water, but I'm not really concerned about that. It's a large probable loss. It's not certain, but because my time preference is to satisfy my needs right now, I do not worry about that. Okay. So what it comes down to is that the large probable loss in the future, I'd rather select that and then go with this water I can have right now. So in a case like this, I'll decide not to implement reservoir sedimentation management. I select to rather have this large loss in the future. These are future generations, and it doesn't concern me. If you view it from a system 2 point of view, what we now do is say, well, time preference is not that important because I really want to look what happens in the future to future generations. So right now, I'd rather accept a little bit less water. So there's a small loss here that I'm experiencing right now. I can implement reservoir sedimentation management because of that. And because I'm preserving storage, I only have a smaller loss, I can now ensure that future generations will be able to have water from the system in perpetuity. So what I'm doing is I'm creating intergenerational equity, which means that I am following a sustainable development approach. So this means that for system 2 thinking, we have to implement more mental effort. Okay, we have to analyze how we can manage the sediment. We're going to have some water losses here, and what we really want to do is to optimize the benefit cost ratio. So from a system 2 point of view, rational thinking, this is what we would go for. So let's just summarize. In system 1 thinking, what they do is they don't really put in a lot of effort, and they just have a subjective feeling of what the storage loss might be in the future, and they essentially ignore that and essentially go for this system here where they can lose storage in the future and not create intergenerational equity. It's not a sustainable development concept. Whereas in the rational approach, we accept a small loss of water here, we manage sediment so that future generations can still accept water supply. So that's irrational, and the other one is rational, and this is really what we need to go for, what we normally do not do. So this whole system 1 thinking, the irrational thinking, leads us to where we are right now. We are building these dams. We are not putting in enough effort to preserve them in the long term, and we are losing storage, and it's not a sustainable approach to infrastructure development. So how does this practically come into play? Let's look at economic analysis. And my understanding is that all of you have done this in your bachelor's degree, economic analysis. So what we have here, the way we do that is we'll develop a cash flow, and this is the cost of building the facility, and this here is the cost of maintaining it, and then over time we have benefits that we have to take into account. So what we do is normally we discounted everything so that we can come here to a net present value, and this is the equation we use. Okay, so we discount the benefits, we discount the future cost, and we do not discount the construction cost because it's right in the beginning. But one thing that you'll notice when you look at the analysis of large dams and reservoirs, is that the cost of losing the storage is never accounted for. And those costs, if a reservoir fills completely with sediment, you have to decommission it, and that decommissioning cost is hundreds of times more than the original cost of construction, because you have to decommission it. Then you have to build a new dam so you can now have water for your future generations. And the question is, why is that not ignored? Why are these costs ignored? So just to explain that in terms of discounting, if we would implement it here, if we would put the decommissioning cost in there, if we discount it, what it comes down to that this high future cost really comes out to have a very small net present value. And that is why economists generally ignore these costs in the future. Okay. But that is not the correct way to do it. There was an economist by the name of Utelling in the 1930s that looked at this whole issue of developing exhaustible resources. And what he said is, well, if you develop an exhaustible resource and you want to analyze it economically, is that the value of this resource must increase at the discount rate, okay, over time. So what it means is really if it increases at the discount rate and we discount it, that this discounting is really doesn't come into play. Okay, so if we would discount this cost here using the Utelling principle, what it comes down to is that its value here remains unchanged, and this completely changed the way that we look at the resource. So now the question is, if we want to preserve a reservoir storage space, we want to ask the question, is this storage space exhaustible or is it a renewable resource? And the answer to that question is really that reservoir storage space have a dual nature. If we decide when we design the dam and reservoir and operate it to allow it to fill with sediment, then we classify it as an exhaustible resource. On the other hand, if we design a dam and reservoir and operate it in a way that we can preserve the storage, in other words, we manage the sediment, then we classify it as a renewable resource. So this is really a decision made by the designer. The designer decides whether a reservoir is renewable or whether it's exhaustible. Okay. So now, if we apply this Utelling principle to economic analysis, and we decide that we want to have the reservoir full with sediment, then we classify it as an exhaustible resource. But now, if we do that and we apply the Utelling principle, we have to account for those losses in the future. That will decrease our benefit cost ratio. On the other hand, if we decide to manage the sediment so that we can preserve the storage, we classify it now as a renewable resource, and we have to balance the cost and manage and benefits for that situation. So you can see this requires much more effort to optimize. Okay, so this is system one thinking. This is the result of system. This is the result of system one thinking, and this will be the result of system two thinking if we preserve the storage space. So the second thing that comes in now is the whole concept of engineering design. And in engineering design, there is a concept known as the design life. Yeah. Okay. So if let's say, for example, we would design a highway, we can have, say, a design life of 15 years, and we do the economics and see it's economically viable. And after 15 years, we can resurface this highway, and we can essentially use it in perpetuity. So we are creating intergenerational equity with this. So for normal civil engineering design, that is acceptable. But when it comes to dams, it is not. This is a dam in Venezuela that silted up in about 5 years, and it completely demolished the existence of the communities downstream. So what you can see is once a reservoir is filled with sediment, there's very little one can do about it. Okay. So this whole belief currently that reservoirs are exhaustible resources and that can fill with sediment is really not a good idea. So this whole design life concept that we use, for example, to design conventional civil engineering infrastructure is not applicable for when designing dams. So really what one have to do is to look at these concepts. Traditionally, with this design life paradigm, we assume the reservoir is going to fill with sediment and it's going to have a limited life, and we have to decommission it here at the end of its life and build a new dam. What one should really do is all these current facilities that has been designed with the design-like paradigm is to create some intervention here that we can manage the sediment and preserve the storage space so that over the long term, future generations can continue to use it. And when it comes to new projects, we have to develop sustainable designs so that we can continuously use that storage space over the long term. That is where we are striving towards. So what do we do? What is the road ahead? Firstly, we need to adopt a sustainable development approach. So what we really want to do is to develop projects that create intergenerational equity. Secondly, to accomplish that, we have to change our behavior. And we have to implement the findings of cognitive psychology and make sure that we adopt System 2 thinking as standard practice. Okay, and doing that, we can develop, adopt, implement sustainable development policy, and we can develop and accept professional codes of ethics that will help us to stick to this System 2 thinking. Now, if we look globally, where sustainable development policy as far as dams and reservoirs are available, or alternatively, where countries where this concept to preserve storage is implemented by managing sediment, there's only a few countries that do that. Sudan here is one, India, China is, Turkey, Italy, and your beloved country, France, has a very good system of the regulators requires management of sediment in your reservoirs. All these other countries here don't have policies like that, and then the white ones are where we do not have information. Secondly, ethical principles can be developed, and this here is the fundamental ethical principles of the American Society of Civil Engineers. It's just the fundamentals. They have an expanded explanation of all of these. But these principles could be to create safe and resilient infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure. Secondly, to treat all persons with respect and dignity and require equitable participation. That is applicable to both current and future generation. Okay, and what our job as engineers and scientists is to use our knowledge to enhance the quality of life for humanity. Okay, so if we use that, we can move towards sustainable development of infrastructure. So how do we do that? We create an envisioned focus. We honor all these ethical principles. And in the case of dam engineering, we adopt a holistic approach by dealing with both modes 1 and 2 failure of dams and reservoir systems. Okay. We don't not only look at dam safety, but we also look at preserving reservoir storage. We do that by fully understanding the concept of sustainable development and creating resilient designs so we can deal with these uncertainties associated with climate change and implement System 2 thinking to make rational decisions. So what are the key takeaways? What I told you is that although we are adding a lot of reservoir storage for building new dams, we are currently losing more storage due to reservoir sedimentation than what we're adding. To deal with that and to create intergenerational equity, we have to manage sediment in those reservoirs to preserve storage space. And this is accomplished by changing or modifying our current paradigms in engineering, design, and economic analysis of long-lived infrastructure. And we can create sustainable development policy, understand cognitive psychology, and move in that direction. One thing I must say is that as French people living in France or studying there, you can be very proud of your country because your government, when it comes to long-lived infrastructure, they have already changed the way that they look at the economic analysis of that. And this is really something, if you are interested in that, is France is leading in that sense. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I hope we can create some discussion here. I trust that I have stimulated your thoughts and perhaps created a different view of how you develop sustainable, or how you view sustainable development.